Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's great to see you all here for tonight's session on Getting to Zero, Municipal Planning and Zoning and State Codes. I'm Aaron Gunnarsson with PHMass, Massachusetts, and we have put together a great program tonight. We have three featured speakers, Hannah Payne from the city of Somerville, Seth Fetterspiel from the city of Cambridge, and Deb Crossley from the city of Newton. You've seen many of them at our meetings before. I'm glad to have them here to present tonight and talking about how their local communities are starting to include passive house in their own local policy initiatives, whether it's through zoning, development guidelines, or other ways that you'll hear about tonight. We're going to kick things off, though, with our own Hank Keating, who will set the stage, talking a little bit about our programming and about state-level policy initiatives that are going on around passive house and net zero. Then he'll give it away to these speakers, and we'll end with some Q&A and discussion for everyone. So once again, thank you for being here. I'm going to turn things over to Hank.
Yeah, so as Aaron's doing that, essentially the first slide we're waiting for is simply to point out that this is a continuation of our Passive House plus Renewables equals Net Zero Energy promotion campaign. We are trying to promote the role of Passive House in achieving net zero energy. And we want to position Passive House as the platform for net zero building codes. And we want to maintain and expand the passive house rebate programs that we have with MassSave. So we'll be doing this every month, each Tuesday, through our fall symposium, which will probably be in October. Next slide. So our net zero future is being defined by new regulations and incentives. But from the top down, and we're in an extremely active period where we have state legislation that just passed, regulations and code changes that are under works now. And from the bottom up, we've got all kinds of local bylaws, zoning revisions, design guidelines bubbling up from the bottom. And what's common is the concept of net zero. Go ahead. But what is net zero? And I love this definition. A 2050 statewide emissions limit that achieves at least net zero statewide greenhouse gas emissions, at least, which is interesting. And provided, however, that in no event shall the level of emissions be higher than 85% below the 1990 level. That's a lot of information in one sentence that kind of is a little bit confusing. What you have to understand is this covers all sectors. So transportation, industry, not just buildings. We tend to think of just buildings. And it includes offsets that include things like carbon sequestration by natural and working lands. So under the climate bill, net zero, it's not really net zero greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, think about air travel, et cetera. We're always going to have some of that residual. Go on. The MassSave draft 3-year energy efficiency plan, which has just come out as a draft, it fully supports the 2050 roadmap to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. It has a huge emphasis on electrification and equipping buildings for clean heating and cooling through weatherization. And this is where we think, this is the key to electric heating and cooling. If we don't do the proper weatherization, and from our point of view, that means thinking about it from a passive house point of view, we're going to have trouble with that. They have a new path to zero initiative for one single family to 4 units. We just attended a workshop session on that today, and we're once again urging that they use passive house as a yardstick, as a quality control measure for even that small a program. they're building in a new net zero energy modular home offering, and they're working on continuing the multi-passive house incentive program that we've had for the last 3 years that's been so successful. Now, there are public hearings coming up on this plan, 3 of them, June 2nd, June 9th, and June 15th. And this is a major opportunity for people to look at the plan and to offer comment to reinforce these things. And I think on our website, we will offer some additional guidance as to what kind of comments that should be made. Something like I was mentioning today about this just now about the Path to Zero program, 1 to 4 initiative. It's being formed as we speak, but it can be influenced through these public hearings coming up. Next slide. So at the same time that this is happening, DHCD just proposed revisions to the QAP. These just came out essentially this week also. And they're proposing strengthening MBE and WBE participation, but interestingly enough, there's no responsiveness to the state's climate bill goals built into the QAP revisions. And we believe that they need to consider revisions to their environmentally friendly design section of their QAP. And many of the potential points that you could get, we think should become prerequisites in the spirit of the climate bills that the state has put out, including things like 5 years of energy and water performance reporting, not just for passive house, implementation of smoke-free housing policies, use of applicable energy efficient programs such as lean or mass save programs. The idea here would be that you get points if you go ahead and take advantage of these programs and use enterprise green communities as a mandatory checklist. These are just thoughts that we have about what they should be doing. Right now, they're doing nothing in this. Go to the next slide, please. And then there's right now, they do not differentiate between new construction and rehab. We know that under the state climate bill plan and the CECP that tremendous amount of rehab has got to be done. And we think that DHCD has got to set up different scoring tracks for rehab versus new construction. And they need to set LEED Gold as a minimum for extra points, not just certifiable or silver. And passive house certification, we believe, should be 5 points more than LEED. Right now, it's probably like 3 points. And we think they need to do more with adaptive reuse in the form of proposing specific energy reduction levels. Maybe it's 30%, 40% EUI. Maybe there's another level with a different point system for EnerFit. And then they need to have extra points for heating with efficient heat pumps and more for rehabs if they're doing that. And then they should seriously be considering extra points for in consideration of embodied carbon of building materials. None of this is being considered by DHCD right now. Next slide. So this is what's interesting. This document just came out and the public hearing on it is this Thursday, May 13th. I don't think too many of us are going to be ready to jump into that and make comment, but written comments can be submitted by the end of the business day on May 20th. So we've posted here the amendment that is proposed itself, which when you open it, you'll see it only speaks to a little bit of MBE, WBE, and nothing else. And we will post on our website a sample template letter that you could use to urge them to take on some of the other topics I've just been mentioning.
I'll mention that's up now at that link at the bottom, phmass.org/policy.
Okay, great. Next slide. So let's go back. What is net zero for the building sector? The climate bill tasks DOI with writing a definition of net zero building in the new municipal opt-in specialized stretch energy code. So it's worth noting that DOER is going to intervene in the stretch code at 2 points. They're going to go into the existing stretch code that has been adopted across the state. They're going to make changes to it to make it much more energy efficient. And that's going to become automatically promulgated to all the communities that already have a stretch code adopted. Then they're going to go ahead and do a municipal opt-in specialized stretch code. And that's where they will be defining net zero. And there's a question. After they define it, will they actually require it in the code? And if they do require it, will it be for all new buildings? Will it be for existing buildings? Will it require all electric, including domestic hot water? Will it, then you get into the real details, will it allow diesel fuel backup generation? Will it require off-site PPAs for renewables? What type? Will it account for embodied carbon of construction materials? So outlining here just the real scale of these questions that DOER is going to have to tackle in defining net zero for buildings. They are going to be working on it now, and they intend to have a minimum of 5 public hearings beginning this fall. And this is going to be, again, a major opportunity for our Passive House and Net Zero community to be lobbying to make sure that the stretch code that comes out of this process is the most aggressive possible. Next slide. So in the meantime, what's going to be happening? That may not be until the end of 2022 that we really see that. In the meantime, local regulations will be provided many varied definitions and standards. So we're going to hear from 3 communities this evening, and they're in the process of setting out standards for net zero and how you incorporate Passive House. And this is all going to be happening as building development proceeds. Over the next 18 months, 2 years, people are going to be working on plans and developing projects. And they're going to be sort of working with what they have in each municipality to see what works and what doesn't. Finally, the Mass Zero Energy Buildings Coalition has written and filed a net zero commercial stretch code with the BBRS last November. And we have a committee working on a residential companion piece to that, which we announced at the BBRS hearing this morning, the public hearing, twice a year public hearing. And we announced that we would be submitting a residential net zero stretch code that will be net zero. It will incorporate a rehab in addition, and it will incorporate requirements for embodied carbon. That essentially, we will be submitting that to DOER because even at today's BBRS hearing, the BBRS noted that under the climate bill, they no longer have responsibility for this. As of July 1, this all falls into the responsibility of DOER. So during those hearings that are coming up in the late summer and fall, that's going to be the opportunity to really integrate these proposed net zero codes into the work of DOER. Next slide. So we're offering the following definition of net zero to try to boil it down to keep it simple. Net zero building is one that first reduces operational energy loads as low as practically possible utilizing the best building science standards before sizing renewables needed to get annualized net zero emissions. That's our equation. Passive house plus renewables equals net zero. Next slide. So we are convinced that passive house, because it's based on fundamental building science and has certified training programs and quality assurance reviews, and very importantly, field verification and monitoring, that passive house certification is the discipline our design and construction industry currently needs to rapidly scale up the production of net zero buildings. Next slide. So with that, I'd like to introduce, I think, is Hannah coming next? Hannah Payne speaking.
Yep, Hannah Payne's next.
Hannah
She's
Payne's
ready to
next.
go.
I'd like to introduce Hannah so she can explain the way that Somerville has recently integrated a lot of this thinking into their current zoning standards. Thank you.
Great. So I'm gonna share my screen. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Great. So hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Payne. I'm the Climate Change Program Manager with the City of Somerville. I'm excited to be here this evening. So I will share with you what we've been doing in Somerville with zoning to incentivize what we're calling net zero ready construction and passive house in that as well. So just some context setting. This is Somerville's greenhouse gas inventory from 2016. Many of you have probably seen this before. About 2/3 of our emissions in Somerville come from buildings. And we, like this, and the whole state now, have a goal of being net zero by 2050. So we really need to focus on the building sector. And all of these buildings that are in this inventory today, most of them will be here in 2050. So we really need a dual strategy approach to addressing new construction separately from our existing buildings. So we laid this out in, here we go, Somerville Climate Forward, our climate action plan that really drives all of our climate policy in Somerville. So this is the plan at a glance, has all of the 13 priority strategies that we identified. You'll see there are 2 that focus on buildings. So the first is really focused on new buildings, so developing net zero and resilient new building standards. And then second is dealing with existing buildings. So I'm going to focus just on the new buildings tonight because that's what zoning can address. And within that, I think I'll just acknowledge kind of to what Hank was talking about before, that if we had a net zero stretch energy code, that would be the easiest way to make sure that all new construction is net zero, or uses as little energy as possible, as much electrification as possible, as much renewables as possible. But in the absence of that, we are looking at strategies that we can apply at the municipal level, and zoning is one of those tools that we can use, albeit imperfectly. So our climate action plan came out at the end of 2018, and this was really good timing for kind of aligning with a very lengthy zoning overhaul process that happened in Somerville over, I think, more than 7 years, so well before my time with the city. And so this really teed up being able to include new sustainability requirements and incentives in the zoning code. So this zoning overhaul was, changed our zoning to a form-based code, really improved transit-oriented development around the Green Line extension stops, and aligned our zoning with neighborhood planning processes that had happened. So there are lots of broad sustainability things that are included in the zoning as well, but tonight I'm just going to focus on the things that are most connected to building performance and energy. Sorry, it's like a little bit delayed on getting to the next slide. There we go. Okay. So the first thing that we have in our zoning is a general lead requirement. So this is very similar to what the city of Cambridge has. So this is across the city. If your building is over 25,000 square feet, you trigger this requirement and you have to demonstrate LEED Gold certifiability. If your building is over 50,000 square feet, you have to demonstrate LEED Platinum certifiability. So this is citywide. And as most of you know on this call, LEED does not get us to net zero building design. And so we recognize that this isn't getting us all the way there, but it's one of the tools we have because it is a performance-based standard, so it doesn't conflict with the building code. So it's one thing we can implement, and it's a standardized system, so developers and are familiar with it. So it's been fairly easy to implement this piece. The second thing our zoning has is a definition of net zero ready. And so I think different from the question Hank was posing earlier of how do we define net zero buildings, this was really designed specifically for how do we define it within zoning, within the bounds of something that we can actually implement. So with this, the definition kind of has two parts. One, the building needs to be either passive house certified or zero carbon from ILFI. And then number two, have no fossil fuel combustion for HVAC or cooking. We do have exemptions for commercial kitchens and hot water. So that is what we have defined as net zero ready. So in Somerville, we talk a lot about net zero ready, also because in our plan as well, because we recognize that getting on-site renewables is going to be really challenging for the density of our city and the size of the buildings that we have. So recognizing that we will have to rely on the grid getting greener as well. So this definition shows up in two ways in the zoning, and they're both optional and kind of incentives. So the first is citywide in residential districts, apartment buildings can meet if they're meeting the net zero ready standard, they can build more units within their building. So you get more units, more revenue. So that's the incentive there for residential projects. Then the second piece is within special development districts. So in our master planned overlay districts, which I'll show you in a second, you can, if you're opting into the overlay district, you're allowed additional development rights, so additional floors, expanded development opportunities. But if you're opting into that overlay, you do need to meet the net zero ready standard. The one exception is for lab buildings in the overlay district. So the lab buildings need to be LEED Platinum, but don't have to meet the net zero ready definition, but all other buildings do. So this is a map, our zoning map. The master planned overlay districts, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there are these diagonal line areas. And if you look in the square 18 and 19, there's a little bit. So these are our major redevelopment areas in the city. So near Union Square, Boynton Yards, and a little bit in the North Point area near Cambridge. Those are the areas that we're expecting and kind of encouraging large development. So really big redevelopment areas. And so in those spaces, that's if projects opt into that overlay, they need to meet that net zero ready standard. So, so the zoning passed at the end of 2019, and then we had this great policy that we then needed to figure out how do we actually make sure that projects are following through on this. So I pulled out just the pathway for BS certification that we've identified. So we do require the full certification for projects, partly because projects are opting into this and choosing to do it to get the incentive. So that's different than what we have for LEED, which is just certifiable. The projects just need to demonstrate that they're getting the points necessary to meet the thresholds that they're required to hit, but they don't actually have to go get the certification. So we kind of have we have 3 good intervention points through zoning. The first is when projects apply for certificate of zoning compliance with their development review application. So at this stage, we don't have too much we can ask for, but we ask that they've signed a contract with PHMass, that they've paid the fee to get their project in the queue, and that they provide a design narrative that demonstrates that they are really integrating passive house elements into their design. Then when they apply for building permit, they have to identify the PHMass rater verifier that's working on the project and submit at least the second round of comments from PHMass, so we can check to make sure that they're following through in the process and well on their way to getting certified. At certificate of occupancy, so this is kind of the last time that we really have a good intervention point with a project through zoning so at certificate of occupancy. And so at that point, if a project is fully certified, amazing, great, they can give us that certification certificate. We will also accept a pre-certification letter and evidence that the project is in the final certification review queue. So a lot of this we're trying to figure out as we go of what works and how the review processes are going on because we're relying on that third party. And then within 1 year after occupancy, we will look for the project to submit a full certification certificate to the city. So to date, so for the residential density bonus, we've had 6 projects so far that have completed the documentation for the development review application and have nearly 200 units in the development pipeline of passive house certified housing. Oops. And I'll also just note that this doesn't exclude the projects from having to meet our inclusionary housing requirements. So a number of these will also be affordable units. So the image on the right is just, I don't know what I keep hitting that is, sorry, is just a screen grab from our zoning ordinance. So you can kind of see how the density bonus plays out. So you can see the arrows pointing towards the net zero ready building. You can build smaller units within the lot area, basically. So you can build more units within the available square footage. And we also have, if you're building 100% affordable housing, you can also get that same density bonus. I believe to date, we've had much more interest in the passive house net zero ready density bonus than the affordable housing one. And I'll just note that all of the projects that are pursuing the residential density bonus have gone with the passive house pathway. There is the ILFI zero carbon pathway, but we haven't had any projects take that on to date. Okay, so just a few takeaways to share. Having like the third party certification has been really helpful, and actually requiring that for minimizing what staff need to review and the need for specific expertise in-house. So, we don't have on staff someone who can review a detailed passive house submission and all of the energy modeling and all of that. So having a third party be able to do that is really valuable. I think the mass save incentives have been really helpful in offering an additional bonus for financing of these projects. They get the bonus of more units to sell and can access that mass save funding. I think that's a positive because we're seeing more people want to take this on, and in that we're developing more of a market and increasing familiarity with passive house design.
In Cambridge, like Somerville, is committed to achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And like Somerville, the vast majority of our emissions come from buildings. So buildings are the key focus of our strategy. And the strategy that we've developed to
you,
phase out
Hannah. That
greenhouse
was
gas
fantastic. And
emissions
yeah,
from
we'll
buildings
get
over
to
time is
questions here at
called
the end.
the Cambridge Netzer
I know some
Action
folks have them in
Plan.
the chat room already.
This
You can
plan
be filling that up.
came
But now
about
we're going to welcome Seth Fetterson
from a
from the city of
2013
Cambridge. Seth,
citizen zoning
are you
petition
ready to go?
asking that the city require all new construction to achieve net zero emissions, and that that was broadened into a comprehensive study looking at how we can address greenhouse gas emissions from all the buildings in the city, both new and existing. And since Hank spent, was really focused on how we define net zero, I wanted to show this slide about how Cambridge has defined net zero so far. So currently we define it as a community of buildings which annually produce a balance of zero greenhouse gas emissions. So we are focused on greenhouse gas emissions versus on energy. And I think for urban environments like Cambridge and Somerville, that's really a key distinction and one that we would strongly advocate for in the state regulatory process. And allowing the ideas that allows for both on-site and off-site emission reduction strategies. I would mention briefly here that we're right now in the process of updating the Cambridge Net Zero Action Plan. And one of the key ideas that has come forward has been in addressing embodied emissions along with operational emissions, which are not currently part of our definition. And I'd love in the Q&A to talk more about how embodied emissions fit into Passive House. So the Net Zero Action Plan, again, focuses on achieving emissions reductions from both existing and new building efficiency, and then bringing in the off-site and on-site renewable energy supply. And the way we project to achieve these emission reductions is largely through increases in energy efficiency, acknowledging that we have a limited amount of renewable potential in Cambridge, and that the cheapest electron is the electron that you don't have to use. So Passive House certainly fits very well into the Net Zero Action Plan framework, given its very strong emphasis on efficiency and driving down demand. And in terms of as we look at new construction in Cambridge, getting back to, again, the impetus of the Net Zero Action Plan, the original plans laid out a target timeline for achieving net zero emissions from new buildings, beginning with municipal buildings to lead by example, and then followed by small residential buildings, 1 to 3 units in 2022, and most other buildings in 2025, giving a little more time for labs. And so the municipal requirement is in effect. You can see our net zero ready construction in the schools that have recently been completed, the King Open School most recently. And then we're just in the process of finalizing the design for the Tobin School near Alewife, and that will achieve net zero emissions. But like Somerville mentioned, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we implement these requirements from an administrative and legal standpoint. And so for us, seeing the development at the state level is, again, I think a really promising direction, and one that we're hoping can open a pathway for achieving net zero emissions in Cambridge buildings without necessarily requiring as much individual action at the local level, and enabling for more coordination, certainly regionally, if not statewide. So as following the passage of the climate bill this winter, we're pivoting our strategy somewhat from focusing more on local zoning strategy to more on advocating for a statewide net zero stretch code that meets our goals. So with that as context, I'm going to spend a couple minutes now talking about more backwards looking, what we've done so far through zoning and how Passive House fits into this. So the Net Zero Action Plan recommended that we both look at our existing green building requirements through zoning, as well as for existing buildings, opportunities to increase exterior insulation, which I think is a component of Passive House. And again, this zoning infrastructure has been in place for a long time. So in 2010, we adopted Article 22 of the zoning ordinance, which required a green building review process. And you can see here the requirements that were established in 2010 that have since been updated. And the overall goal of these requirements are to promote environmentally sustainable and energy efficient design in both new construction and also major renovation projects. So this applies similarly to Somerville, largely to buildings greater than 25,000 square feet, both for new construction, but also significant renovation. And looking backwards, and this is a year or two old now, these data, so the numbers have increased. But almost 100 projects have been subject to this zoning, leading to around 20 million square feet of development. And the website here, and I'm happy to share these slides, leads to a dashboard which allows for easy exploration of these projects and getting a sense of what the zoning has delivered to date. And so to quickly run through a few of those results, with our LEED certification basis, we've seen a fairly even split between LEED Silver and LEED Gold, and the more updated version of the zoning does require LEED Gold as a standard for most buildings, so we expect this to shift towards gold over time. And this table, and I apologize that it's small, shows the breakdown in building type. And so while we have a significant amount of commercial use, the slight majority of the projects to date have been residential. And so I think this, again, really opens the door to using Passive House as a pathway, given how compatible it is with multifamily residential development like we see in Cambridge. And this map just gives you a sense of where these projects are located throughout the city. And so as we were considering how we might update the green building zoning requirement, one of the things that we did was we looked at what we were getting from LEED. And what we found is that, given the dense urban environment that we were in, a lot of the points were coming from location-based categories, process-based categories, again, the site, but energy and atmosphere really stuck out as a pretty low performer overall. And it seemed like, a lot of the projects were kind of taking the low-hanging fruit that were the points that they were winning by default, just based on their location in Cambridge, and that there was potential to really stretch in that energy performance area. So seeing what we had achieved so far really helped to inform the decision to, in the update process, which was completed in 2019 to the zoning, to add Passive House along with enterprise green communities as two new optional pathways. So LEED is still a pathway option for buildings, but if a building chooses enterprise green communities or Passive House, then they do not need to achieve the LEED certifiability. And along with this, we also are requiring a net zero narrative. So if the building isn't achieving net zero today, to at least get a sense of how they would go to achieve it in the future, and thereby consider many of the options for how they get there. So I think this was, again, just a first step, and I think to really meet our net zero goals, we need to work on how we can take the further steps. But overall, I think we've seen a positive reception from the development community, and particularly from the affordable housing community, and having Passive House as an option, and by being able to use that option to be able to bypass the LEED requirement, and having that be a bit of an incentive for using Passive House. So I just want to wrap up with three example projects that we've seen in Cambridge using Passive House. So the one that has been completed so far, that I'm assuming most of you are familiar with, and I know Michelle's on this call, so she can speak in much more detail than I can to Finch Cambridge. But Finch Cambridge, which was completed last spring, was the first, again, Passive House multifamily residential project in Cambridge. It has just under 100 units. And I think this quote is actually from you, Michelle, in an NPR interview, but I think it really captures the multiple benefits that we get from Passive House. And I think Bev was also quoted in that NPR article talking about the relative costs of this project and how it was very cost competitive with a standard project. And so again, I think it's been a great case study for how Passive House really works, not only from an energy and emissions standpoint, but in really addressing the affordable housing crisis that we are simultaneously facing in Cambridge, along with the climate crisis. And so Finch has done a great job of leading the way. And then since then, we've seen a number of additional affordable housing projects choosing Passive House as their preferred green building pathways. So right now in the permitting process is a residential project in Central Square, 2072 Mass Ave. This is just under 50 units, also 100% affordable housing, and using Passive House along with other net zero technologies to really provide a high quality building for its residents. And then another project also in the permitting process is an addition to the Ringe Towers in Alewife. This project is being put forward by Justice Start, also about 100 units, and includes both housing, but also a community center with workforce training to really try to create a more inclusive community experience for its residents. And again, we see that the typical benefits of Passive House coming in with the air quality, the smaller HVAC equipment, and trying to take that attitude throughout the building to the products and materials that are chosen for it. So again, I just wanted to give a brief overview of some of the progress that we've seen so far in this in Cambridge, and we were very eager to work together over the next year and a half in terms of working with DOER and the BVRS and others to think about how we can integrate these lessons into a net zero stretch code that can apply statewide. So looking forward to the discussion later. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Seth. That was great. It was really good to see Cambridge taking the next steps, and those examples were good. We'll have some questions for you at the end as well. We're going to move on here to our final presenter, Deb Crossley, City Councilor with the City of Newton. Let me just get some slides up here. All right, Deb, are you ready to go?
I am. Am I on?
You are.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm honored to be here, actually, because I am a city councilor. You can go to the next slide. It's okay. I'm looking at you, Aaron, but I'm assuming people are looking at me anyhow. I was asked to speak here by members of our Building Standards Committee of Green Newton, which is an all-volunteer advocacy group. And the subcommittee called the Building Standards Committee is a group of very talented residents of Newton who give enormously generously of their time and expertise. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is how their activism has influenced our progress in Newton. We are a much smaller city than either Cambridge or Somerville, and we are only, unfortunately, beginning to make some progress with a massive zoning overhaul, which is to build upon the vision of a comprehensive plan adopted in 2007. So I'm going to spend a tiny bit of time going through a timeline here that will give you an inkling of how much we've struggled over the years until this turning point. In 2008, and I served on the Comprehensive Planning Advisory Committee to the mayor at that time. So adopted in 2007, the Comprehensive Planning Group initiated a number of early action items, and one was to adopt a special permit criterion, which requires energy use and natural resource conservation, but it had no clear metrics. It was simply a fifth criterion that said you basically have to do better than code and you have to put together a sustainability plan. It took years to get people to actually understand what that meant. But it did begin to raise awareness, and succeedingly over the years, understanding by the city council, then board of aldermen, and eventually by the developers who were coming before us. Notably in Newton, all projects over 20,000 square feet require a special permit, and our special permit granting authority is vested in the city council. So fast forward to 2015, after many years of deliberation, a relatively small, but for us, a first major development of 68 units was approved for 28 Austin Street. This was a modular construction patented called Green Stacks that claimed high performance, but again, there were no metrics. We weren't digging deep at that time. In 2017, I think this was a first turning point. Oh, by the way, I served on the land use committee as part of the special permit granting authority for 10 years until the end of 2019. So I was right in there trying to push the working of this fifth criterion. The 24 unit apartment complex on Langley Road, because there was an architect, Perkins Eastman, who many of you probably have heard of. They did an important school in Cambridge. And a willing owner put together the first real sustainability plan that elaborated on the measures that they would undertake. And they agreed not only to an extensive list of measures that they would commit to for this project, but they agreed to analyze and share with us the feasibility of a second fairly robust list of measures. And in doing so, throughout a design development process they agreed to in the special permit process, we learned a lot. And they wound up making a building that reduced the energy demand significantly. And they wound up adopting all but very few. It's an all electric building, heat pumps, significant stormwater management systems, and so forth. So the next project that came up was Washington Place, which is 140 units. All these have affordable housing in them, but 33% for Langley, 25% for Washington Place, now called Trio. But we got them to actually hire New Ecology to create that sustainability plan. And we said, look what the guy before you did. They were able to do it, much smaller project, and it wound up good for everyone. We expect you to do the same thing. So, and this continued. I'll show you some examples of projects later. In 2019, by the end of that year, we adopted the Newton Climate Action Plan, which is extensive and does have some teeth. And in 2019, the Green Newton Building Standards Committee was established, who I also already described to you. Next slide, please. So I thought this was extremely significant. We had something called a high performance building committee before this, also with Green Newton, and I and others were part of that effort. Again, strong community ground up advocacy. This group formed ahead of several major important developments in Newton. They helped us to guide zoning amendments also in 2019, and to further expound on that special permit criteria to give more specific guidance and more teeth to it. They have advised and continue to advise developers. They've become extremely well respected and are now invited in because the developers rightly believe that if this group is going to approve their project, the city council will listen. It's also been a great boon to our planning department. Again, we're a smaller city, barely 90,000 people, and our staff is commensurately smaller. So this group also has tracked and continues to track new developments. And through our extensive special permit review, they check in on the interim standing of the project. They're really right on top of it, and they even help us craft language in the council orders. Next slide, please. So on the one hand, as Cambridge described, there's existing buildings which are tougher to, and I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but this group did help us remove some of those same barriers to reducing home energy by allowing exterior insulation into the setback, heat pump compressors into the setback, and front and side vestibules up to 4 by 6 feet. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. So again, this group has become a force. And so they meet with the developers and they state their terms. The 4 principles they work by is to minimize energy use, which of course is primary. By adopting passive house or some very stringent standards, to electrify all mechanicals and more if possible, minimize embodied carbon in materials, minimize transportation carbon by reducing car trips, and by looking at the transportation plan. We normally require transportation demand management plans for these new developments. Next slide, please. So here's some projects. Some of you may have heard of the Northland project in Newton. It survived and thrived against a citizen petition, a citizen referendum against it after we spent several years working with this developer to pass this project, which contains 800 units of housing. Along the lines of that very first project I told you about on Langley Road, the 20-something units, where they proposed a list of measures they would commit to, that met our 5th criterion, and then they agreed to an additional list. We did the same thing with this project. So initially they agreed to, and they basically went to school to learn about passive house as a result of the work of the Building Standards Committee. And they agreed to 3 of the residential blocks that they could go ahead and and commit to make those passive house. As part of the rigorous design development phase that we required in the special permit, they have subsequently adopted 2 more of the 8 residential blocks and agreed to make them passive house. And they're working on the last 3. If they get to the last 3, if all 8 residential blocks become passive house, then there'll only be a few, like a dozen units outside of that that would not be smaller buildings. So they have heat pumps in all the buildings. They did a low embodied carbon analysis, the first one that I've been privy to. And I watched the structural engineer in discussion with the Green Building Standards Committee members who was willing to make significant concessions to reduce embodied carbon. Did that slide just change? Oh, and significantly, this building has a rigorous transportation demand management plan. It is not right next to a T-stop, a little bit outside of what we might consider a 10-minute walk. So instead, they committed to a free electric shuttle service every 10 minutes to the T. They built a station for that that's very comfortable for folks, and that's what's going forward. Next slide, please. Riverside. Riverside is at the end of the green line, and it does include the mechanics bay and the green line station. It also intersects with the commuter rail, and there's a dedicated access from the highway. So you couldn't get more transit oriented than that. In addition, there are numerous pathways, bike paths and so forth, pedestrian pathways, and a commitment from this developer to put about $3 million into the Charles River pathways that abut it. This project is back before us for a 3rd time right now. It's currently 550 apartments with 111 affordable. I think they just increased that by a little bit. In fact, I'm going to that meeting from here. The reason it's back before us now, it's the same developer. We approved the project a year ago, is because of COVID. The whole economy of uses that had been proposed has tanked. There was going to be a large hotel as part of this project, and one commercial building, and they're petitioning for a second commercial building to bring life science labs into the program. So they have committed to passive house for 3 of the buildings, the residential blocks, and will use heat pumps to service all the residential spaces. And they will commit to doing embodied carbon studies. Next slide, please. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So Riverdale is significant because it required a comprehensive permit. So this one actually is not part of our special permit process. It goes before the Zoning Board of Appeals. And it's unusual, to say the least, to find that we can get one of these projects to do more than they have to do in order to get permitted. As you probably know, the comprehensive permit process, or also known as Chapter 40B, is protective of affordable housing projects. And so if you try to impose conditions that they can find financially infeasible, then a case would get overturned. But the Building Standards Committee, again, was successful in meeting with the developer and convincing them that they should give it a try. So that's why that's significant. Next slide, please. So we have a number of things on the horizon. As I mentioned, we passed a climate action plan at the end of 2019. We have a sustainability team working hard on that, along with our Citizens Commission on Energy, thank you, on NCCE, who really pushed the envelope on that plan, another citizens group, but a formal commission ordained by the city. And we're working in the Public Facilities Committee of the City Council, which I also serve on electrification following, let's see, who's done it so far? Brookline, Arlington, and Lexington have submitted home rule petitions to the state legislature. We're working on our own, and along with an ordinance that would require all electric heating, cooling, ventilation, and more for new construction and substantial renovation of residential and commercial projects. We also have an air source heat pump campaign, getting homeowners to switch to electric heating and cooling. And on the renewable energy front, Newton is, I think, the furthest ahead in municipal aggregation, purchasing Class 1 RECs at 80%, totaling 80% renewables. And we've done a lot of work on our municipal buildings. That's a subject of another talk, but we have in 3 sessions now adopted many projects across our municipal buildings. We have 78 municipal buildings, rooftop and solar canopies. These have not been all easy to pass, particularly the solar parking canopies, but we finally got them all in so far. And we have placeholders in our ordinances. As I said, the Green Building Standards Committee was instrumental in helping us to further inform our 5th criterion, being specific about the kinds of certifications that will pass the bar. And we adopted similar to Cambridge and Somerville, a LEED certification or certifiable for projects greater than 50,000 square feet gross floor area. I thought I had a slide on that, but we might have skipped over it. Passive house, of course, and or I should say, Enterprise Green Communities Green Building Rating System. And we also are requiring now, as part of the specifics related to that fifth criterion, that electrical vehicle charging stations be part of every project. A minimum right now of 10% of the parking spaces must have charging stations, and another 10% at minimum must be charging station ready. So, and there are reserved sections for requiring solar panels on commercial rooftops, for setting up metrics on embodied carbon. We're not there yet. And I'm watching what everyone else is doing. And again, the electrification of existing new construction and renovations, major renovations on existing buildings. I think there might be one more slide. Yes, these are things that are in our climate action plan. We have a lot of ambition in the city of Newton, and we're working on measures that will achieve these kinds of percentages over time in order to get carbon neutral by 2050. And I think that's it.
Deb, thank you so much. That was fantastic. It's great hearing the story here, and I'm struck with Newton with how collaborative an effort it was between the City Council and the Building Standards Committee and Green Newton, really working towards this goal. I'm curious, is that why you think you were so successful in getting these developers to go passive house, or was there some other component that made them willing to learn about it, as you said, and go above and beyond what you were initially asking them to do?
There's more than one thing always that I think encourages a developer to do more. Certainly the City Council Land Use Committee is demanding of large-scale developers, not always for the right reasons. But if you leverage that with ideas that nobody can argue with, nobody can argue that it's a good idea to reduce the energy demand in new construction. Nobody can argue that, we adopted a climate action plan. Here's one way we can begin to implement it. But I personally think, as I said earlier, a really important moment in our community was when the Building Standards Committee became formed, but also pulled together a very focused and rigorous methodology for identifying, tracking, meeting with developers. They've got the expertise, they got the respect of the developers and the council. So it all works together.
That's great, thank you. I want to open up the questions for everybody. So we'll kind of go into discussion mode. Following up on, though, I want to start with one question for Hannah, actually. As I was struck by the Newton story, I'm curious, what led Somerville to incorporating passive house in their zoning requirements? Did it come from similar community initiatives? Were there champions like you or others within the city? What was the impetus for passive house?
We had a lot of advocacy on kind of pushing more green development in our zoning. So there was a lot of focus on LEED. Passive house was part of the conversation. When it came down to it, though, we were also looking at what are third-party certification systems that we can use that could be a piece of that definition, kind of acknowledging that we don't have, we weren't in a position to create our own system or standard. So that's why we went with passive house is really the one that was like, okay, this is how we would get the loads down. And then we could ask projects to electrify. That's kind of meeting our needs. we added ILFI as another option, kind of recognizing that projects might need some flexibility, want to choose a different path. That's obviously targeting, more of the embodied carbon, less on the like driving loads down. But it was really that third party system that we could use. So kind of looking beyond the lead, what's next, and that was Passive House.
Great. That's fantastic. And seeing what is verifiable and what's actually going to deliver the results.
Right.
Seth, it seems like that's kind of similar to Cambridge, where you started with these, lead requirements, but then you noticed you weren't getting the energy reduction you were really looking for. Is that what drove the interest in Passive House there in Cambridge?
All right, trying to find my mute button. Yes. Yeah. So like I was describing, seeing that kind of mediocre energy performance definitely drove the interest in Passive House. And then I think, seeing Passive House as a as that common standard that then could be the baseline for, moving towards the net zero emissions goal that we're really trying to reach.
That's great. Thank you. I want to turn it over to questions from others here as well.
I'd like to ask each of the presenters. It interests me that in each case you're using LEED certifiable versus certified, which is, well, it's common to you, but it's also what Boston has done. And I'm just interested in why it's certifiable there, but certified Passive House. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it should be certified Passive House, but I'm curious as to why it's only certifiable on LEED. Because, we believe with Passive House and we've seen studies that Passive House projects that are certified, in fact, perform better than those which are simply certifiable. And that we expect would be the case for all of those systems. Just interested in what your thoughts are on that.
So I can answer that one. And for Somerville, at least, the LEED requirement is citywide. So, it's partly like we feel like we can't ask to like go through that full certification. In addition, like I was saying before, the intervention points we have on a project don't align with when you get certified. So even though we're requiring Passive House certified, there is a bit at the end where we are, really hoping that project follows through and gets the certification, but like we don't have the tools as a city to hold that, we have to use a carrot, not a stick at that point. So for LEED, along the way, we can ask for those checklists, make sure they're submitting everything, that they're designing their building to meet the points, but, we can't necessarily follow up in a year and say, oh, you've been using your energy as you've planned and getting the renewable energy, buying your renewable energy as you've promised. Like, it's really hard to get that certification at the point of, we're not going to kick people out of a building that they're already occupying, for example. So that I think is like part of the trade-off that we're trying to figure out. Passive House also has kind of some checkpoints along the way that help us understand where the project is heading. And again, in Somerville, we have it's a opt-in incentive. So we're comfortable also asking, yes, pay this outside third-party reviewer to do this.
Right, that makes sense. You're differentiating that the LEED requirement is citywide, not just based on zoning. So it's not an incentive for zoning. It's just an overlay. Yeah.
It is through zoning. But it's not an overlay. But yes, it is citywide, applies across, regardless of what type of building you're building, where it is. If it's over 25,000 square feet, you have to do it.
Yeah.
But if I might just chime in, it is definitely different to be certifiable than to be certified. And whether lead or whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's actually going through the effort to demonstrate and evaluate, which makes the difference, I think. And so, I mean, we care about that a lot with Passive House, but I think LEED should care about that a lot too. So LEED certifiable is only as good as the reviewers are at evaluating what USGBC would be evaluating. And I think that's a weakness.
I think the other
Again, I
point
agree
to
there.
that, Michelle, is that from a real estate market perspective, when you have something that's third-party certified, we can actually verify it through the appraisal process as well. So that, you know, and I think that gets lost on developers, you know, when there are easier standards to meet when it's LEED certifiable versus actually going through that process. We definitely see on the back end of the real estate sales perspective that, you know, there's real value that's added in the appraisal for something that's certified.
So I'll say that I agree with you that certifiable, there were years when I spent in the land use committee, City of Newton on special permits, where I said frequently, it doesn't matter if it's certifiable, we need someone to vet it. And we did go to third-party certification requirement. It started with that one project where New Ecology was hired as the sustainability guidance, and from there the Northland project actually put a whole team together of really competent professionals, I think. But your point is well taken. You know, I'm not sure why we require Passive House certification and not LEED certification. I do remember that initially some of the smaller developers, and we have a lot more small development in Newton of 20, 24 units, the price seemed on top of everything else to be a barrier for these small developers. So, you know, actually pushing them to be more specific about the measures they were adopting and the efficiency ratings they were achieving and so forth became more doable. But we're open to learning more and trying to make these requirements more rigorous.
I was pleased to see that both Newton and Cambridge have allowed for enterprise green communities, because that's in many regards, it's more flexible, it's much less expensive and often free, and it's very compatible with all affordable housing programs. So that's a good option for developers that don't want to get involved in fees to the LEED certification process. Deb, I was interested, I think that the Green Newton Building Standard Committee is such a fascinating approach to this whole problem and so effective. I mean, this is, how do you get to be a member of that, what turns out to be a very powerful committee?
I would say that our environmental community, our environmental advocates in the city of Newton, Green Newton has been around for 30 some odd years. I think a little longer than that now. And it's a fairly close-knit group. And we just have some very passionate, talented people in the city who over time have connected in very strong ways. So anyone who has a reasonable background, I'm sure, I mean, Bev Craig is here and Betsy Harper is here. Other folks on the committee you probably know, Peter Barrer, Dan Rubin, Jonathan Cantar, Paul Eldrenkamp, all those folks live in Newton. They are phenomenal. Architect Jay Walter, there's more. And then we have a woman named Helena Brown who visits, and she's the chair of the Citizens Commission on Energy right now. which I served on before being on the council as well. So, we have a lot of these volunteer opportunities in the city. And for folks who are passionate about a particular thing, they seem to be willing to give their time and expertise to the city they love and the cause that they're really passionate about. So anybody who has those things can join.
Can join, Well, I mean, it's fascinating because essentially you've taken a special permitting tool for 20,000 square feet and above and turned it into a situation where you have this committee that can effectively negotiate with the developer for anything that is coming down the pipe. It can be solar, it can be embodied carbon, it can be any of these things, right?
Yes, I'm going to say that there are a couple people in the group, several people in the group too, who have outstanding negotiating skills. It's not every day that we get a lot of passionate people who come before the city council who want more affordable housing, more green space, more parks, more bikeways, you name it. In my opinion, this group, it has a combination of talent and listening ability, respectfulness. They've been able to just, meet people where they are. And I think, the developer of the Northland properties has an extraordinary team. They're also really interested, but they knew nothing about Passive House when they came in. And they've actually given, it's a beautiful development. They've given to a lot of those causes, affordable housing, parks, stormwater management, really at the top of the line. But it's just recognizable when this group comes before the city council to testify, they're teaching and advocating and in a very respectful way. So you could see people just starting to listen. When that turning point was so significant to me because I felt like I no longer had to be the one cranky voice always saying, what about how are we meeting the fifth criterion? It's just made a big,
it's a great story. Aaron, do you have other questions in the chat?
Sorry, unmute myself here as well. Yeah, and folks can keep adding more. We do have a couple here, specific ones. So it's for Somerville and for Newton here. So for Hannah and Deb. So Deb, what do you think your chances are of home rule and electrification in Newton? That was one question that came up here.
Well, we have decided as a committee that we are going to pursue it, if that's what you mean by success. After that, now that's in our committee, that has to pass full council. But I expect to be successful in passing full council and getting a home rule petition and a proposed ordinance moving forward. My hopes can always be dashed, but I think we'll pass that bar. Then it's a matter of, we've talked to Cindy Crean, and when is the legislature going to take it up, which they decide. So we hope that more communities are going to seek home rule and try this. Because we'll just be the fourth, and unless somebody beats us to it, which would be great. So I don't know what success in the legislature will mean. We're also hoping that by doing this, it will be just another push toward your work, or can't remember whose work it is, but you were all talking about pushing the state, pushing the BBRS through the DOER to require electrification as part of the stretch code going toward net zero. Because as you know, there's net zero and there's net zero, right? You can say it and you can buy a bunch of crappy RECs from Texas to make it happen, or you can do it and you have it be really meaningful.
great. Hannah, a question for you in Somerville. There's interesting one around the flexibility of, when you do this as a zoning requirement in these special districts. The specific question was around the 70% fenestration requirement and how that might conflict with passive house designs in some ways. But the broader question is about, is there flexibility within some of these zoning requirements? Are you able to work on a project by project basis and answer some of these concerns that folks have?
So the short answer is no. That's the beauty of zoning. There is no flexibility unless you apply for variance. So I think very different from Newton's case, a lot of our zoning is trying to actually make a process where the expectations are really clear and kind of getting away from that special permit. You don't really know what you're going to get or be asked. So the question about fenestration, I wish I had our zoning planner on. So in short, I think we are allowing exemptions for the first floor retail, and that is because of the what we want for a lively urban space. I'd have to look back at projects and look more closely at what's actually being proposed. But so far haven't gotten direct pushback from teams proposing this. And then I did see another question that was for me. I can just answer it now about Union Square development. So that the master plan for Union Square with the master developer, that was approved prior to this new zoning passing. So a lot of that is not, doesn't fit into these new zoning requirements. However, the lots around it. So that's kind of the first bit of development, but a lot of the area around it that's not US2 is subject to the new zoning and is in the master plan overlay district. So we're seeing first projects that are being approved for a master planned overlay is the Boynton Yards area. So really just right adjacent to Union Square, and the new T-stop will be there.
Thanks, Anna. Great answer. And I do, yeah, you're right about that zoning requirement, making it very clear. And I like that you have to do passive house, or as you said, living building challenge as well, though you noted that I think they were all passive house so far. So yeah, interesting.
I think the mass save incentive is good, and people are more familiar with it, right?
Right.
Don't really know what we're getting with Isle of Eyes air carbon.
Those are sort of all the questions I see in the chat here. I'll give it a couple minutes to see if anyone else has anything that they'd like to say. But in the meantime, I really want to extend a thanks to Hannah, to Seth, and to Deb for speaking tonight. It was great to have you here and hear about the stories going on in Somerville, Cambridge, and Newton. I think you really are setting some good examples for how to incorporate some of these policies at the local level. And it seems like success stories so far. So thank you.
I had a quick question, or maybe not that quick, but Seth, you mentioned that with the passing of the new climate law, that some of the focus for net zero planning is shifting towards advocacy at the state level to line up that new process with the goals that are evident in these 3 cities' zoning regulations. I wonder, I get the sense that you're all talking to one another in cities, you're members of metro mayors, things like that. But how do advocates and practitioners plug in? How can we support that advocacy from your point of view?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that, Tom. I mean, I think, so yes, we are, as I mentioned, doing our best to coordinate with each other and magnify our voice at the state level. We're also very eager to coordinate with the advocacy community. So we participated in some of the zero emissions code development conversations for the VRS, looking backwards. And I think, where this community can really help is to provide kind of the technical support and frameworks for folks like Hannah and Deb and I, who work more on the policy end of things, to then be able to amplify that message from the policy lens. So I think if Passive House Massachusetts can help us, understand in this case how Passive House fits in to a net zero code proposal, and have more of these conversations to really work out together what are some of the logistical challenges that we see at the local level. So the certifiable versus certified one is a great example of that, and you know, where within our zoning and permitting authority kind of the time frame sits, how that works. So I think, you know, being able to kind of work together to workshop some of these questions and figure out how we can come up with proposals and approaches that really meet as many of our mutual goals as possible.
I think that's a great summary. We stand ready to really work with you and advocate for these things. And I do think, as I did in my earlier introduction, we have so many opportunities coming up between the 3-year plan, between the QAP, and between the building code hearings that are going to be coming up. The next 12 months, I think, are going to be formative in terms of making real significant changes, that we need to work together to really make it come out right.
Yeah, and one other thing I would add before passing it on to the others is helping us know when to plug in. You know, I think we all have limited capacity and wear many hats, and so you know, Hannah and I attended quite a few BVRS meetings over the past couple of years, but there is a slog, right? And so knowing, you know, when is it really worth putting in the effort to try to and really trying to align our resources around those common goals. So I think it's really helpful to identify what those channels are, like the 3-year plan, like the new net zero stretch code development process, and then figuring out how we can most efficiently engage in that process as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Seth said. The other like bits I will add is, you know, for folks in positions like myself and Seth, like we tend to have either planning or policy background, not necessarily engineers or architects. And so that technical expertise is something that city staff tend to lack. So if you are working on a project in one of our communities and agree with the goals of where we want to go, and you're seeing something that is challenging or you think can be improved, I would say reach out to me. I won't speak for anyone else, but I think staff want to hear from you about, you know, those specifics of how can we improve our processes, because we're not always seeing that on the development side. And then, you know, I think just plugging into the efforts around the stretch code and all those other advocacy pieces, having that technical expertise, we're going to be loud and vocal about, you know, how we're constrained as cities, you know, what we need the state to do to meet our climate goals, but we don't necessarily have the details like of here's what the code should look like and here's how to get there. And so I think that's been really helpful, having that coalition of folks, including on this call, who, you know, are putting forth those code proposals.
I would just add that I would advocate forgetting about passive house or the different standards. I would advocate for certified, or at least if you don't go certified, measuring certain pieces of information. And I think as a community, you know, I think passive house has determined what it thinks is important to actually measure before certification is appropriate. But I don't think certifiable is a very meaningful metric. And without some degree of measurement, and we can, you know, we have to evaluate what measurements relative to what standard. I don't know that it's that meaningful. It's a great starting point, but I think we're past that now, frankly. And we need to understand what does need to be measured so that we are not just checking a box and we actually know that we're on track.
That's great. Thank you, Michelle, for that final point, because we have reached the end of our scheduled time, I want to be considerate of our speakers' time here tonight. So thank you all for joining us. We had some excellent participants and good questions. I think all of you would make excellent members of your own building standards committees in your local communities. So hopefully we can get them everywhere. Find out more about our events at phmass.org. You can click on the policy section to see some more of the stuff we were talking about tonight. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next time. Take care.